Hey, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you. My name is Patrick Fry. I'm the CEO and founder of Venture Valuation and Biotechgate. So we are hosting this 5-day partnering event, Biotechgate Digital Partnering. We are happy to work together with Christian from Broadreach Global, who is putting together a number of panels and discussions for us, and also this one on innovation in digital delivery of mental health care. So I think another very interesting topic to discuss. People are joining now. I think we have quite a number of people that have signed up for this discussion panel. Just a quick background. So as I said, Biotechgate Digital Partnering, it's our 10th anniversary that we are doing this event. We started in 2020 during the pandemic to allow people from all over the world to continue to do business development. And we believe there's still a great need for that, beside obviously meeting face to face, which is as important or even more important. But I think still people, or you'd like to do some business development in between, and these virtual conferences I think are a great opportunity to do that. And I think beside the partnering that we provide during these 5 days, we have these different panels and discussions. So I'd like to hand over to Christian, who is moderating the panel, and thanks again for being our partner for this number of panels that you've put together.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be here. This has been a fun week. As some of you have noticed, we've had a bit of a neuro digital stream this week, and today we're going to take a neuro and mental health and digital focus. But I wanted to say it's not just us helping out Biotechgate. Biotechgate provides the partnering for our own in-person events, and not just online. What Patrick maybe didn't mention, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's somewhere close to 20 years that Biotechgate and Venture Valuation's been running partnering and developed the systems for some of the leading events in our sector, mostly on the biotech side initially, but now more broadly. So for the in-person meetings as well, this is great. Patrick, it's good to be here. Good to see you. And I'm happy with this panel today, because even though we talked about neuro the past few days, we kept touching on mental health in the investor session, the business models, and yesterday in the pure neuro digital therapeutics, we also touched on mental health. So today we're going to talk about digital health for mental health and mental health care. And I'm not going to try to summarize everything that's covered in that today, because it's a big package and a broad spectrum of approaches. But we're going to get into that with our panelists. I'm going to introduce both of our panelists right now. And Naomi, I'll ask you to come back on camera if you can. We have Naomi Glover and Paulo Machado, both good friends, both of whom were instrumental for the Neuro, Digital, and AI Innovation Summit. We ran it as a pilot in Lisbon in October, and we'll do a full meeting in October next year. So we're already scheduling that to follow up. Some of our partners were eBrains and the Human Brain Project. The European Brain Council is the main partner. Biotechgate providing support in the partnering. Naomi's Applied Neuroscience Association. Then we had partners like Cambridge Cognition, Medable, Effectia, and Mazards. So it was a lot of fun, very broad mix of people. And today we're going to have a small panel really touching on the mental health side from slightly different but complementary perspectives. So I'm going to do ladies first and introduce Naomi and then Paulo. But Naomi is the co-founder and director of the Applied Neuroscience Association in the UK. And I'm going to stop the intro there, because Naomi, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself properly. Paulo was really instrumental when I wanted to focus on AI and digital health and technology for neurosciences and mental health with this meeting in Lisbon and the broader initiative we're building, and was really one of our key advisory committee members there. Paulo, I'll ask you to provide your background, but I'll say Paulo is an angel investor and involved in an angel fund. He's an advisor to a number of companies. He has a long background in digital health in the brain space with a mental health focus. And although he doesn't like to admit it, he had a long pharma background before that, which, Paulo, I guess you like to leave in the past, but you do have that as a reference in any case. So Naomi, can I ask you to tell us a little bit about your own background in the ANA, really, and then we'll move to Paulo, and I'm going to ask Paulo to tell us a little bit about his investing roles and approach as an angel and via the fund and his interest in the space, and then we'll get into the questions. Naomi?
Yeah, that of course, a pleasure, and thank you so much for having us here, but for partnering with the Applied Neuroscience Association. It's been a real privilege and a total honour to be with you, and it was fabulous to be in Lisbon as well, and seeing you bring so many different diverse people together with such a focus on neuroscience, but how they can bring together all of their various threads. So hugely looking forward to that again next year, and I hope that as many people as possible will be able to join us. So my background is quite varied. I have done about 20 years in learning and development, but my focus moved towards neuroscience when I could see the benefits that could have for the people that I was working with. So at the time it was leaders, but also teachers and individuals generally across society. And so as I learned more about neuroscience and I took a master's in applied neuroscience, the focus was about how can we get this research from the labs out into the real world. And what I realized was that there were people doing that really well. And then there were people doing that, well, not very well. So there were people who were purporting to be using neuroscience, but there was no evidence behind it. They were doing it unethically. It was much more of a money-making business than a genuine desire to make a change in the world. And so I looked for an association that I could join where we could make sure that we were using best practice and ethics, and it didn't exist. So I co-founded the Applied Neuroscience Association just this year. We launched in March, and it has been an amazing experience. We're very, very strongly supported by King's College London academics, and by you, Christian, and by a number of other people who have been absolutely instrumental in our success so far. So we're hugely grateful. And we're building a professional body for people who want to apply neuroscience in education, industry, healthcare, and society. And we're delighted to have anybody come and join us who's interested in that space.
Thanks, Naomi. And I have to say, for a new association, I was really impressed with the reach you already have, not just in the UK and Europe, but internationally. So it's quite impressive. And I'm looking forward to staying in touch and working with you as you develop it further. Paulo, you've got a very different background. I alluded to a few things, mostly because you leave the pharma side out. And I think even if it's not the focus today, it's important to note that that is there. But how would you, present your focus and your, perspective for the audience?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to chat about this very important topic. In terms of background, so I actually spent the first decade of my career in the finance world. So trying to figure out how money flows through systems in and around the world, and entered healthcare via pharma. Spent a decade there learning how the healthcare systems work, but as we all know, pharma touches every segment of healthcare. So I had a really interesting vantage point to learn about healthcare systems in the US as well as abroad. So it was a really wonderful experience, having spent that decade there. And that's where I had my first exposure to the mental health space. Specifically, the pharma company I worked for had neuroscience portfolio of assets, and then eventually launched Abilify, which really pushed it into the mainstream in terms of it being a mental health company, mental health pharmaceutical company. After the time I had spent at Bristol Myers Squibb, then I went over and was involved, and this is where things pivoted a little bit more into the emerging technology and analytics side versus the medicine side, is where AstraZeneca was developing. But this is back in 2006, in the age of the dinosaurs as it relates to digital health evolution, so to speak. But yeah, spent a couple of years at AstraZeneca helping them figure out what their digital health strategy and partnership strategy was going to be, because at that point in time, it was truly unknown. There was not much going on. High tech had just happened. ACA was just in the early stages. Much of the infrastructure that exists today just wasn't its very nascent stage, or just didn't exist, frankly. So I was very lucky to be involved in the very early days. And then after a couple of years of doing that work internally, I decided to go off on my own and really focus on supporting the early stage healthcare startup community, which I've had a passion for since I'm very interested in technology. So I've been doing pretty much the same thing since 2008, which is supporting early stage startup companies. Mental health has always been a high degree of interest of mine, but not exclusively. I work across the stakeholder community with the payers and the providers, because scaling matters, obviously. So just startups doing things on their own doesn't always get them to scale. They have to figure out how to fit into the ecosystem, and the existing stakeholders support that scaling process. So I get involved in helping organizations figure out how to build better products, how to build better business models, and how to scale them. And recently, in the last few years, I started becoming an investor, as you alluded to, Christian. I've done that through two different pathways. One is a limited partner in a healthcare fund, MedStarter, actually. And then the other way is through What If Ventures, which is focused on mental health, angel investing through an angel syndicate. Both have been wonderful organizations to work with, and given me some really interesting opportunities to work with some really amazing and interesting and potentially impactful organizations. But these are all early stage companies that are not out there making big impacts yet, but they are making a dent.
Thanks, Paulo. And that's a great intro to this, because things really have changed over the years, and it's important to follow the evolution. We are focusing on mental health today. So, before we start getting into digital mental health, can we talk a little bit about the scope of the problem? I know we were all looking at slides which had some data from a decade ago, and it was already massive. But can we talk a little bit about the size of the problem as a medical, unmet and insufficiently met medical problem, the need, and the market size, the number of patients affected, whether in the US or globally, because this is a problem which until recently, and we'll touch on the change, but until recently it's been underemphasized and prioritized and lacked resources and focus. So can I ask you guys to share a little bit your insight on sort of the scope of the problem and where some of the real challenges are before we even get into digital?
You want to go, Naomi, or?
Yeah, I can do. So I was having a look at some of the recent statistics, and from addiction, dementia, schizophrenia, the sense is that about 1 billion people worldwide are suffering at the moment from a mental disorder. Lost productivity as a result of just two of the top, so the most common mental disorders, which we know are anxiety and depression. That alone is costing the global economy somewhere in the region of about $1 trillion every year. And so in total, poor mental health is estimated to cost the world economy about 2.5 trillion per year in poor health and reduced productivity. That was back in 2010, and it's projected to rise to $6 trillion by 2030. So we are, it's rocketing, and we're seeing that in local statistics as well. So, for example, the number of young people with a mental health disorder was previously last year was about 1 in 6, and already now they're saying it's gone to 1 in 4. So it's rocketing.
Yeah, so it's truly a massive problem. Paulo?
Yeah, some information on the US side has been interesting. So pre-COVID, we had roughly an 8% incidence, over 8% incidence of US adults having depression, and post-COVID, 21% of Americans expressed they're experiencing some kind of high level of distress. So big growth there. Not sure where that's going to, frankly, go back to. Hopefully it drops back to where it was, which is already an epidemic. versus where it is now, which is truly sad for the world. And then the other piece of it that was really interesting was as we all heard of late, is kids and the impact mental health COVID specifically has had on the mental health of our children. I think the numbers I saw most recently, it was 19% of kids were considering suicide of high school age, which is insane, which is a 36% increase in the last decade. So clearly crisis mode. Interestingly, everyone's trying to figure out what to do about it. Unfortunately, specifically in the US, I'll speak to the US, there's not a concerted effort, so to speak, that can be done because everything is segmented and fragmented across the country. So it's state by state, city by city. There are some national efforts underway, but it's not an NHS where Naomi is where they can actually say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and you push the whole country in that direction.
Yeah, and I think we'll see similar numbers in terms of size of the problem as a percentage in most countries, regardless of whether it's a US style system or a single payer system. The approaches will be different, but I think and again, before we get into digital, we're talking about the size of the challenge, but it's largely an unmet medical need in terms of people receiving care, right? So if I looked at Andy Keller's slides, from Lisbon, there was something like 16% of patients were being treated and 6% were resolved. If I might be getting that wrong, let me take a quick look.
Yeah,
pardon me. 47% right. Detected, yeah. 24% treated, 9% adequately treated, and remission in 6% of cases of those detected. Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
so
that's correct.
So there's an inability to even diagnose, or many people going around undiagnosed, and many of the diagnosed untreated, and many of the treated insufficiently treated. So there are challenges in the traditional approach, which I guess brings us to the well, we can talk a little bit about again, before digital. Paulo, you already mentioned COVID and the spotlight this shone on the problem, right? And compounding the problem. There may be other factors as well. I don't think we need to try to diagnose all the causes today of mental health issues in society and why it's increasing, aside from the pandemic and the restrictions and so forth. But what, in your view, has led to the prioritization? Is it just COVID shining a spotlight and making people really aware, spending time with their children and working at home with their families of the presence of the problem, or is it also a generational issue and a greater awareness to talk about mental health challenges? Is it societal norms changing somewhat? Again, this may not be the most important issue, but I think it's interesting to at least touch on, why are we finally recognizing the problem? It's not only because it's a growing problem.
No, I think you're right. There's clearly a lot of different variables that are driving it, at least in the US. I'm not sure what's happening across the pond and elsewhere in the world, but frankly, this has been going on for quite a while with the rise of social media and just the rampant use of tools and emerging technologies that are moving faster than our brains can frankly handle them effectively. There's a lot of focus been put upon that. And even before COVID hit, I think that we were already on a tight trigger around what's happening with social media as it relates to impact on our brain health. It's been seen, it's been studied. There's some studies that have shown that it has definitely not had a positive impact overall on people in creating divisiveness, stress, anxiety, and it's becoming much more okay to talk about mental health issues, frankly, over the last decade, right? I mean, that's just something that is not spoken about in former decades. Hard to admit it was an issue, right? If you think about it, just people not willing to admit in the past that they were not well, and now it's just becoming much more acceptable across all the generations. I mean, that's been shown in the studies I've seen too, that it's become much more acceptable to admit that there is an issue, and then willingness to seek help is way up. So the data you quoted from the Meadows report that we looked at commonly, that's from a decade ago. I'd be surprised if it wasn't more likely that more people are seeking help. And the most recent studies I've seen, especially post-COVID, have shown that people are in crisis mode, right? When you get in crisis mode, it's kind of hard to hide it, especially in children. The parents are seeing it in a much more visibly. So there's a lot of efforts by school systems to bring basically mental health care into the schools. Unfortunately, parents are not equipped to manage mental health issues. And you saw some of the stats, you heard some of the stats that Christian mentioned. Just the level of detections are low, the levels of remissions are even lower, adequate care versus just general care. People are struggling to figure out what to do. It's frankly a horrible maze. I've had a whole series of mental health issues in my family directly that I've had to deal with. And I feel like I know a little bit more than the average person in healthcare, having been in it for a couple decades, still struggling to find what are the right pathways to find the appropriate care for whatever the issues that are ailing the people who I love. And getting them access to the care becomes a massive issue too. Even if you find the right toolkits, how do you afford it? Who's going to pay for it? Adoption at the insurer level, again, Naomi, probably different in the NHS, but it's all happenstance. If you happen to be in the wrong state and the wrong insurance plan, you're not going to get coverage to what's the latest and greatest, because adoption curves are slow as it relates to coverage for mental health in particular. And mental health, there's, I don't know, half a dozen at least new emerging mental health therapies that have great promise, not universally covered by insurance companies, actually barely covered by insurance companies. I understand why they're not. They need to see some evidence before they're going to just write blank checks for this stuff. But the reality is it's moving a lot slower than the disease we're experiencing, disease and disease we're experiencing as a society. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think those are really helpful and interesting comments, Paulo. And, if we look traditionally, there has been a long pharma focus on psychiatric medicines, but the track record of these is not great, to put it mildly, right? There may be some more promise in new approaches around precision medicine, at least targeting specific symptoms. There may be some real potential in psychedelic therapeutics, but there's a lot of noise in that space as well, and real clinical development needs to be done. But these are part of the solution if and when they're safe and approved and efficacious. We need more. So if we look at the digital side,
can I pause on that? It's not that we need more. We need more. We need the correct number of effective therapies that have been shown to make a difference. We definitely don't need more, because we have over 300,000 apps right now across every indication in the marketplace. The vast majority of them, frankly, don't pass muster. Only about 40 so apps account for 83% of the downloads. The vast majority of the apps that are put into these stores, which is the direct-to-consumer side, and mental health is a significant chunk of that, don't meet any basic standards, right? They just don't look for FDA approval. They don't proclaim that they're clinical, but yet people are going and using them versus actually seeking care that could make a difference. So I don't know if we need more. I think we need more effective therapies that actually pass the gauntlet. I liken this to when I was in the pharma world, right? There is the actual, what they call the ethical side of things, where you go through the process of developing a drug, doing the studies, spending the hundreds of millions of dollars it costs to do the work to show that it's safe, effective, and the FDA approves it. You get a label and then you sell that. Versus anyone who just wants to go out and do over-the-counter stuff, right? Yeah. Vitamins, minerals, and just make whatever claims they want. And as long as the FTC doesn't slap down on them, they can just sell direct to consumers. And we know that's a multi-billion-dollar market. Massive. With very limited clinical effect. And that's kind of what's happening in the digital health space, specifically mental health, even easier, because it's much easier to tell somebody they're having an impact, improving your mental health without you really knowing it. And just selling.
Yeah, that's a really useful way to frame it. And thank you for that. I think, one of my pet peeves is I look at some of the really big wellness apps, which I think, by the way, are great. I'm glad they do what they do, but they have massive amounts of money. And really what they've done is found a way to digitally deliver, yoga and meditation, which is nice, but it is, and it's good for all of us, but it's not really targeting medical need, right? And then, as you say, there are a bunch of other apps in the wellness category making a bunch of claims, which they may or may not be able to deliver on. We don't know, because there's no real clinical proof.
So could I just comment on that real quick? So I agree. There's the vast majority are not focused on clinical, because clinical's hard, right?
Yeah.
Costs money. Now that it takes time. Prices have to go up direct to consumer, because these are not covered, right, by insurance companies. People now would have to pay a much higher price for things like Headspace and Calm versus the normal monthly fees that they charge now. But that being said, companies like Calm and Headspace are moving into the clinical space. They're making acquisitions of companies like Ginger and Ripple, and they're starting to make clinical claims. So they realize that there's a need to go beyond just what we will perceive as wellness without certain effectiveness, and they are starting to do this study. So it's evolving. The first foothold with their business model was direct to consumer, because frankly, it's easier, faster, and you can actually monetize it, so you can scale it, right? But that being said, I think they see that it's not enough. And now with frankly, the awakening of the healthcare industry in the US and having to take on the risk for Paulo Machado not being mentally well, they're just less likely to prescribe something that doesn't have clinical effectiveness as a healthcare company. And they're looking for solutions that actually they can prescribe as part of the treatment plan, and they can have validation and they can see data on. So there's a whole series of additional layers of complexity when you go to scale these things than just putting out an app and putting it in a store. So that's why I'm very cautious about the more part, and just really make it about the more effective stuff that's fully integrated and scalable.
Yeah, very, very good points. And I'm going to have to take a look at some of those trends that you're talking about with Calm and Headspace and Ginger and so forth. I haven't looked recently, so that's good news. If we talk for a second about other approaches, because it's not all digital therapeutics for mental health, right? There is some digital delivery of care, which is just getting care to populations and patients and demographic groups who have not had access. And that may be socioeconomic demographics. Those may just be people in rural areas or away from clinical centers of excellence and care. Have either of you looked at some of the approaches in that? Because there are multiple organizations from big incumbent health systems and payers in this space to really small novel startups doing something. Paulo's smiling, so I think you have an opinion on some of what's going on out there. But Naomi, I think you also have some real views on the health equity side.
I think there's a huge point. I think you're absolutely right. The health equity has been a major and will continue to be a major stumbling block for getting the right healthcare to the right people, and getting the right education to the right people. So, for example, during COVID, there was huge disparity in how much access people had to basic things, a computer to be able to access their schoolwork or to be able to access doctors. And so all of a sudden, many organizations were able to take content online. They were able to start working from home. Doctors very quickly started taking calls from home, and that was fantastic. So it's really progressed digital acceleration of therapeutic care. But there are still a lot of people who don't have access to the technology that they need in order to be able to access it. And what we saw again is that poverty has a huge impact on mental health, as you would expect. And the economic crisis, certainly in the UK at the moment, we're seeing 1 in 4 families with children who have food insecurity. And again, so we have these issues where people don't have access to, whether that's technology or whether it's food, but they're things which are going to impact on their mental health in the short term and in the long term.
Yeah, I think that's a massive issue, and we're certainly seeing that with the economy in the US as well. Unfortunately, it's an ever-present problem in the US, as in some other places, but just given the nature of our economic system and market and approach to healthcare, there is a bit of I hate to say synergistic, but it can be a bit of a vicious cycle somehow, and in some cases. So those issues are there. But I also think when you talk about technology, it's not just it's also the economics come into it, but also demographics, right? Because if we think about children, if there is an app that works on smartphones, that's probably well targeted to them, in terms of the technology platform. But if we think about the elderly, some of them are very comfortable with smartphones, some of them are not, and they are comfortable with the tablet. And a lot of these approaches are not optimized for use on a tablet. Or, some of the different telemedicine approaches for digital delivery of care with an actual therapist, for example, are not optimized to work on mobile phones. So, we not everybody has a desktop or laptop plus a tablet plus a smartphone and familiarity, technological familiarity to use all of them at the right scale. And very few of these solutions are optimized across all of them. But I do think it's important that digital delivery of care, perhaps combined with an AI and an application that not just tries to solve it by the AI or the chatbot talking to the patient, but helps make sure that people in need are directed quickly to a therapist, regardless of where they are, rather than being put on a 6 or 8 week wait list for an appointment. Because this is a challenge, and I know it's a challenge in the UK. It's certainly a challenge in the US. I am not a specialist in this, but I am unaware of any place in the world where you can immediately get, a referral for adequate mental health care if and when needed for patients. There's always some sort of, I don't want to say runaround, but process which is not necessarily very efficient, right? So getting to a human therapist can take time, or getting to the right care. So maybe if we dive into the technology side, what can digital health do in the mental health space? And maybe rather than trying to summarize everything in detail, what are some of the modes, or the approaches that are being used in digital healthcare? There's cognitive behavioral therapy, but that's not it, right? That's just one area. Can we talk a little bit about, what have been the approaches so far, and then what we're starting to see?
Just one quick comment happy to do that on the pop health equity thing. I was smiling because literally there's a 2-day webinar on population health equity in the US that's going on right now that I stopped watching to jump onto this call.
Oh, wow.
People much smarter than I go into the gory detail from lots of different angles. Happy to share that link if you guys would like to, but it's an incredibly complex challenge, right? And the reality is being dealt with, like the answer to your next question you just asked, it's being dealt with very locally, right? So a health system is doing what it can as it relates to health equity, because it's very difficult to create national level policy. And that's a lot of what this webinar that I'm a part of is focusing on. As it relates to the adoption of digital health solutions and what's happening, it's happening, whatever's happening is happening depending on where you are in the ecosystem, right? If you're a part of the VA, if you're part of a private insurance company and an employer, if you're part of the Medicare system, which insurer you're in, which health system you're attached to, or you're part of an ACO, you're going to have an incredibly different experience. And I'm guessing it's a little different than other countries where it's much more centralized and you're going to have a much more common experience. So there's not an answer. There's many, many different pathways. So let's assume you're working in what I'll call a highly functioning, mentally health focused ACO that has their act together. You're going to get a very different experience. You're going to have a hotline you can call. They're going to have somebody who's going to basically triage you and talk to you. If they are even more sophisticated than that, they may have some form of a chatbot that's kind of hanging out with you before you get into crisis mode or need to call a person mode. So they can probably handle your situation. The tools like Wobot and others that are out there that are trying to do trying to provide some kind of frontline access to that. Majority of people are not using those tools, right? Just pragmatically speaking, it's an interesting idea, but for those tools to get rapid adoption and high level adoption where it's going to make a dent in the market overall, we still have a long way to go before that happens. But that's typically what occurs. There's this some type of digital or human being type triage that occurs. If it's not crisis mode, if it's crisis mode, we know what happens in the US. You go to the ER, you're boarded, and you're going to stay there for anywhere, depending on which part of the country, a couple of days to over a week, right? And you're going to stay there until they find an inpatient facility to put you into. We just don't have systems in place like that. That being said, I also have a good friend of mine who's building a company that does what I think of as a mental health ER. So that you're going to have a very different experience if you have to be in that geography where those things exist. I'm having a mental health crisis. Instead of going to the ER, I go to the mental health ER. All that exists there is people who only deal with mental health. And you're going to be handled and managed in your mental health care. And well-being is going to be handled directly. And the physical stuff is monitored, but that's not what you go there for. So you could, the journey is incredibly different, of course. And in a situation like that, you're going to get handed off to their network of mental health providers. From what I understand, it's still crisis mode where there's just not enough human beings to care for all the human beings that need care. I'm not sure if it's still true in Europe, and I'm guessing it is, because from what I see from the numbers, it seems pretty epidemic levels where there's so many people seeking care, and we can't just fabricate new people. And the efficiency of providing mental care is not that scalable. You still need a human intervention to have the most effective care. There are a lot of digital CBT tools and digital meditation tools and digital depression and OCD tools, et cetera. It's all out there. But the vast majority of mental health care still needs some form of human being to walk a person through it. Drop-off rates are still very high in the mental health. When you talk about digital health side, drop-off rates, right? Retention is decent, but it's not where you need it to be. People don't see their applications through to remission or stabilization. So it's very similar to physical care in terms of a lot of the challenges, getting people into it, getting people to use it, getting people to stay with it. Still very, very significant problems in mental health. Naomi?
Naomi, I'm going to come, and I know you're not at the NHS, but you're, in the UK, and you're aware of the situation there, and you certainly interact with people at the NHS. But I just say, in Europe, if we look at different countries, some have a national system with a single payer, others have a sort of universal health care, but there are regional health systems, and each of which may have a different approach. Not maybe to the extent of in the US, but if we look at Germany. Let's say just on the digital side, we may see regions in Germany where they've piloted digital therapeutics, and the region next door has not, right? And it's going to go region by region. And the same could be true in Spain, for example. And I don't know enough about France to speak about it. But in the UK, I'm not entirely familiar with the arguments, but I have come across clinical psychologists and clinical psychiatrists making arguments that some of the requirements at the NHS are, aside from the academic and medical requirements, and something like only a fraction, 1/5 of the trained clinical psychologists in the UK are actually in practice. And I don't want to get into the politics of why that happens, because I don't know enough. But I think the reality is there is, Paulo, as you alluded to, there are not enough practitioners to treat all of the patients individually, at least not sufficiently. I don't think that's a particularly US. I think that's a relatively general problem in most of the world, and it may be much worse in in some lower income countries where, frankly, they don't have, as they would see it, the flexibility or the luxury to even deal with mental health issues, except in the most extreme cases, right? So patients are completely neglected. And that can, of course, be the case anywhere, but obviously economic resource limitations will complicate it and compound the problem. If we talk about going beyond digital delivery of care, which I think can be really interesting and useful, there are approaches which are broad, right? If we think of cognitive behavioral therapy, if we think of applications which are sort of gamification or mood-based or diagnostic-based, sort of voice analysis. But even from virtual reality and neurostimulation, what are some of the approaches that you're seeing that are the most, I don't want to say necessarily the ones that are having the greatest impact right now, right? Mm-hmm. But what is in the pipeline that may still yet need to be proven, but which at least for you is something which is hugely promising if it can be demonstrated and show the clinical efficacy? What are some of the areas that you're most excited about? I don't want to limit it to what you've invested in, because you can't invest in everything, right? But what are some of the areas that that you feel are really interesting, promising, where there are potential, real impact to be made?
Naomi, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think there's some hugely exciting work being done. I think anything around a more precision approach is very exciting. Historically, we've had a very broad brush approach. Diagnosis is poor, and they diagnose on the basis of symptoms. So, you seem low, oh, well, you've got low mood, or, you seem depressed, so you've got depression. You seem anxious, so you've got anxiety disorder. And so they're just diagnosing on the basis of a symptom, but that symptom can have multiple factors that have, that underlie it, and so require completely different approaches. And as we get better at being able to understand what it is that's causing somebody to feel anxious, rather than just diagnosing it's an anxiety disorder, that will be absolutely transformative. And it's certainly starting. There's more work going on around, can we learn more from genetic data? Can we learn more from food? What can we do? There's the Zoe app, which I don't know if you're familiar with over there. I think it's gone quite big in the States, but they're looking at what are all the factors that could be impacting on your health from a gut microbiome perspective. And so there's areas like that which could be absolutely transformative, which most people have never heard of. They don't know anything about the link between, for example, what you're eating and your mental health. So part of that is about, encouraging those and getting funding and education for people about how they can use those sorts of apps. And that really can scale. That's much more, I think that's much more scalable and could be made affordable, though at the moment it is.
Naomi, can I interrupt you there? Because I think you're hitting on something incredibly interesting, right? Because we're talking about behavioral approaches to managing mental health, which frankly, the same behavioral approaches can be used to manage chronic disease in other conditions as well, But one of the challenges I see, and I wonder if digital health and AI and machine learning and big data in particular offer real potential here. Often the recommendations around which food to eat, what to do to manage a condition, they're based on hypotheses that have never really been tested. They're based on observations from 50 or 100 or 20 years ago, and it became standard of care to start recommending X. And I'll give you an example. About a decade ago, I was involved in launching a migraine application, and that was generating massive amounts of data to, I think the last time I looked, there had been over 27 investigator-led trials and studies published in significant journals, right, around understanding the triggers in migraine. And basically all of the historical assumptions like red wine and chocolate and certain other things are the things that cause migraine, absolutely false. Might be in one person, might not be in another. So the understanding of triggers changed profoundly based on this. And microbiome, there's a need for massive data sets because that changes around the world as well, right? Not just genetics, but epigenetics and lifestyle and diet. But also, what behavioral issues, what lifestyle issues, whether it's food or something else, really do have a positive or negative impact. Some of it we know, but some of it we don't know. And I wonder, is there scope for massive clinical trials, even if they're just observational studies, to really pull out more granular information from the data that can then be applied in new tools? Are we seeing that yet in mental health? Is it there, or is it just, starting in more limited, 300 person or 2,000 person trials where we could be doing 30,000 or 100,000 with the tools at our disposal these days?
I think we're quite lucky in the UK to have resources like the UK Biobank. So there have been quite a lot of studies already, and I don't have any immediately to hand, but certainly there are a lot of studies that are already looking at the types of factors that impact on mental health and also on brain health more broadly. So, you know, if we think about brain health being, you know, something which encompasses mental health, but also is how you're functioning behaviorally, psychologically, emotionally throughout your lifespan, and trying to make that as positive as possible. And when we look at brain health, that, you know, one of the things that we have emerged is that you can continue to improve your brain health right the way through life. And, you know, historic people don't know. The vast majority of people, I think 33% of people believe that you can do something to reduce your dementia risk, for example. But you can, and at least 40% now is modifiable risk factors. And that was just, so it's at least 40%, because we saw a study come out from the Lancet in 2020 that showed 12 lifestyle factors, including things like, you know, obvious things like smoking, but less obvious things like hearing loss. So hearing loss in middle age is one of the largest, if not the largest factor as a risk factor for dementia. Who knows? Nobody knows this stuff. And so there is, you know, as you say, there's a big education piece that needs to happen about public health understanding, but it's not enough just to tell people what they need to change, because everybody knows that exercise is good for you. Everybody has been told for donkey's years, you should exercise several times a week, exercise for this amount of time. Millions of people they know that, but it's a hard thing to do if you're not an exercisey type person. So it's a bit like saying to people, you know, I can half your risk, I can almost half your risk of dementia if you do these things. And if doing that thing is taking a pill, everybody will do it. They'll pay a lot of money for the pill that you can just take and half your risk of dementia.
If you pay money for a pill that doesn't work.
Right. So,
for a little while, but they stop pretty quick.
but the, you know, if the treatment is actually, you know, you need to stop smoking, don't drink so much, do some exercise, keep educating yourself throughout life, you know, it's harder to get people to engage with that.
So I mean, we're living in the best time that we ever have. I mean, the technologies that are emerging today, and I don't mean just the hard technologies, and I'll go through some of those that I think are going to be groundbreaking potentially in the next decade or two, but also what I'll call the scaling technologies that Naomi's referring to, right? Just because you build this stuff, health is not something you build it and people just show up. And that's even true for pills, right? We know that one of the biggest challenges the whole pharma and biotech industry struggles with, even for the life-ending diseases, right? Like cancer, people are just not adherent to the protocols that they should be adherent to. And we know that. And that's, again, it's something as simple as taking a pill. Even that doesn't happen. So if we're talking about significant behavioral changes, even more challenging. So that being said, there is a tremendous amount of effort being put into making it as easy as possible to retrain the brain. The brain is not wired for long-term satisfaction. It's wired for short-term self-satisfaction, and taking a pill now for something that may or may not improve your dementia in 20 years, not appealing, much less actually changing something that feels good now, like I want to stay up late with my friends or have another glass of or a bottle of wine or whatever it is. That's not good for my healthy lifestyle or eating lifestyle perspective. Very few people have the discipline, percentage-wise, right, to actually maintain, see the logic in something and the data in something, and then turn that into long-term, meaningful, personal life changes. Even if they do for a while, most of them fall off, and then it's a matter of getting to a point where they need to come back on. I've experienced it myself. I know many people have too. So there's a whole lot of work being done on what do we do from a behavioral perspective, technologically speaking, to improve the mental health status. On what I'll call the more hard tech side, it's amazing what's being developed right now, right? The money is being poured into, and just you mentioned some things like, what do we do with the genetics as it relates to the brain? Precision mental health care by using EEG technology to measure what's happening in the brain, so we can actually give you the right therapy that's appropriate for you and customize it. Electrostimulation, right? Neurostimulation, basically through either electricity or magnets in the brain, showing a lot of promise on both those fronts. Psychedelics, psilocybin, ketamine, and others that are emerging to actually go ahead and do a jump start on the brain and get you a chance to reboot the computer, so to speak, reboot the wetware in your head and see what you can do from if you reset yourself. VR therapy, some really interesting technologies there that are coming up. Passive data capture to drive diagnosis. You mentioned voice, facial recognition, movement patterns. All of these things are being studied. Some already have products in market. Some are in various stages of testing. What else was interesting? Brain-computer interface. There's some really interesting companies that are developing some amazing technologies that not quite shelf ready yet, come into the market, but by the end of this decade, early next decade, for the more serious situations, epilepsy and other mental health issues and challenges, you'll be able to put a BCI directly in, and they'll be able to just prevent things that were inconceivable you could prevent before. So, and you mentioned the microbiome, another interesting pathway to better mental health, right? And how does that work out? It's happening. There's also a lot of the low-tech stuff, frankly, right? That's really emerging. And it's not as sexy from a tech perspective, but also incredibly effective, right? Like, how do we improve community health? That's happening very aggressively. And again, depends on where you are, right? It's not happening nationally, but depending on where you are, there are organizations that are out there pushing hard on improving community health and well-being, giving people purpose, increasing likelihood that there's going to be a meaningful social connection, so that the trends towards social media making you less connected in a meaningful way to people brings it in. I've worked with some companies that are doing exactly that. They're creating meaningful social connections through activity clubs. So that you're not sitting home alone, just doom scrolling your Facebook.
I think you're absolutely right. Sorry to Christian to jump in. I think that the your mention of the neurostimulation is a really fascinating area, and I think and psilocybin as well. And I think the thing that has the potential, the huge potential there, is that people don't need then the willpower to do something, because it's just done. You know, you have the psilocybin, and it's literally transformative for some people. You know, 1-2 doses, and the anxiety has gone, or the depression has gone, suicidality has gone. People who've had this, you know, who've been struggling with suicidality for 20 years or more, and they just come out of it and they say, I just don't feel that way anymore. I've completely changed. And so those sorts of treatments, which at the moment aren't available, will be transformational. But you know, obviously that's a medical treatment rather than a digital treatment, which was where we're focusing here. Neuromodulation is fascinating, and I heard recently from a company that's launching a device next year, which takes that neuromodulation and miniaturizes it into a wearable that you can wear all the time seamlessly, and which will interface with everything else that you're doing, and which uses AI algorithms to give you different stimulation depending on what it is that you're doing. I mean, that sort of thing is fascinating. And then the other thing you were mentioning, how can we trigger people to change behaviors? There's another company that's developing AI-based platform which will do exactly that. So it's working out what do we need to be triggering people to do, and how do we do that? So again, huge opportunities, very exciting.
So bottom line is, with all of this that's happening, the next 10 to 20 years, it will be amazing, could be amazingly different, and the best possible care will be provided. It's just a matter of how do we scale that so everybody has access to it. And that's where a different set of technologies and financial incentives and cultural norms will have to be expected. Because right now, that's just not the case. Now it's just, you have to kind of be in the lucky geography with the lucky insurance company and the lucky health system, and who happens to have providers who have fully integrated. I mean, if we talk about all these technologies, none of them are plugged into the system, right? So all of that data is being captured is not really shared with the average provider of care. There's not a lot of care. I mean, these are all the pragmatic things that are difficult to deal with, but reality, right? Coordination of care across mental health providers and physical care providers just doesn't happen. Shared interoperability of data and records doesn't happen. All these devices and cool technologies, it's all one-off. You got to go find this person on your own. You got to get the care, and then your primary care doc and psychiatrist saying, like, what are you doing? I don't even know what that is. So there's this whole lack of trust and transparency. Data illiquidity is just the case in the mental health and frankly beyond mental health, but mental health in particular seems to be a little bit behind the curve on coordination of care and interoperability.
I think that's really interesting, and not to get away from mental health care, but yesterday in the session with John Krakauer, he mentioned the mind maze approach was really trying to tie in a few of those things you mentioned, which is how do we get neurological patients not just to do a little bit of activity, but in a behavioral sense to train almost like professional athletes. And that evolves around making it an enjoyable, pleasurable, and social experience with connections, Paulo, as you're saying, and then the interventions themselves. And one of the issues he brought up was that pharmaceutical companies, and this is true, and I'm not sure why it stopped other than cost would be my assumption, is in drug trials used to put a behavioral trial arm into the, a behavioral cohort or within one of the, it's not double blind, obviously, right? Because the patients are taking a behavioral approach, but rather than just the placebo control, right? And his argument is that if you implemented some of these just exercise, for example, in the neurological space, neurological drugs would be hitting their endpoints and getting approved where they aren't now, at least in some cases. And so I'm going somewhere with this question or comment, pardon me. I wonder if we look at all the different things in digital health where we have in the mental health space, also in other areas of brain health, we have simple gamification apps designed to get patients to do things which may help them manage their symptoms. And some of them are great, but that's what they do. We have others which are trying to get them to manage their sleep or their diet or to do meditation or other exercises. We have neurostimulation. Now, obviously, we can't roll all of these into one. But is there maybe some room for looking down the road when these approaches are combined at synergistic efficacy? And one of the examples I mentioned, and this is again on the neurological side, not on the mental health side, but if you have mind maze helping stroke patients or TBI patients recover and regain function, not just learn how to cope with limited function during the period of neuroplasticity. And then you have other interventions which can 5x the period of neuroplasticity during which that regaining function can happen. That would be incredibly synergistic. And I wonder, it's going to be a different application in mental health, but we have all of these different tools and approaches. Some of them will show benefit. Some of them might not individually, and it's hard to ask a startup to do everything and roll it into one package. But maybe there's possibly, potential for some better collaborations for companies when they are going the clinical route and doing clinical trials, where they could partner with other companies to add, something to the clinical development program to try to show, improved outcomes in terms of the endpoints. I don't know, this is really just hypothetical and it could be very complicated, but I wonder if that's a direction we're going to end up going in it eventually, or for that matter, combining digital health with psychedelic therapeutics in certain cases down the road, right? If we're doing the wet sort of reset of the brain, and now we can do some digital health for the training capacity. Thoughts on this? Is this really just too off the wall and difficult to apply in the short term, or is there some potential for something like this?
You go first.
I think there is potential for it. I think there's huge potential for it. I think there is. I was at a session recently at a conference in London, and we were looking at a bunch of digital technologies and the way that things are moving. And there's an open source platform that has come out of Health Data Research UK, and I think it's called Radar, and they're looking at, or Radar Base, and it's an open source platform so that you can feed in data using a whole bunch of different integrated devices, apps, Fitbits, Garmin's, different apps, spirometers, or just every type of device that you could possibly imagine. And so the idea is that you'll be able to use it for clinical trials, but also to monitor people while they're going around about their normal day. So hopefully something of that ilk could be quite impactful.
Yeah. So and maybe not for the actual trial, but just taking the observational data to, help companies and help researchers identify what they actually want to study, right? And where they may have the most impact.
So Christian, on the role of pharma and how can they change their clinical trials, there are quite a few organizations that are being very aggressive and pragmatic around embedding medicine plus strategies into what they're doing. That being said, the reality is they need to get a label, right? So anything that creates risk and uncertainty typically is removed from a trial, right? Because you can't just throw stuff against the wall and see what happens, and you spend $1 billion developing a drug, and by the way, because you didn't achieve some type of endpoint that wasn't related to the drug, but some other component you included in your protocol, you missed a label, right? That's just not likely to happen. So they really want to be micro-focused on what they can control, which is typically the medicine itself that they're developing. That being said, once it's on the market, there's a lot of really interesting pharma company approaches to partnering with other solutions, right? Even way back when I was at AstraZeneca, and even before BMS, we were partnering with digital support. I call it beyond the drug support, to get people to do what Naomi was mentioning earlier. How do you get people to do this stuff more often, right? So you take the pill. What do you do to support that? Is it a human being talking to you? Is it an app that reminds you? Is it the cap on your drug that makes on your pill bottle cap that makes a sound? I mean, there's all kinds of technologies and approaches that try to improve, and all of that is digital in a way, but it's all the non-medicine strategies. Is there a diagnostic strategy where you go in and have to get some type of marker checked on a regular basis to show that you're having success? So that gives you the reinforcement. Is there a reward mechanism? There's tons of different things that can be built around it. Do I see a lot of that getting in pre-label? Not much, if any of it, because it just brings too much risk and uncertainty on the behavioral side, right? If they're now not just trying to see a biomarker shift, right? Whatever, like a positive EEG read, let's say that's the outcome. Now, on top of that, they also want to show that Paulo actually did some physical behavioral thing on top of the EEG read. That's just a much harder thing, because now you're trying to get a changing human behavior, and that's not what pharma is built for, right? They're built for developing medicines. The changing human behavior side, frankly, is what I'll call the rest of the ecosystem in many ways. Pharma plays a role in that, but they're not the primary drivers. I mean, to me, you're asking, will this happen? I think it will. Again, it's going to be microcosms of organizations, right? These value-based care organizations that are going to be at risk for the lifetime value and cost of Naomi's well-being and her costs, all integrated, like the NHS is in a way, right? And they're going to have to figure out, okay, what's the most effective way to get Naomi to be well? It could be a prevention strategy, it could be detection, it could be giving her monitors for her home for passive data capture to see if her gates changed. There's all types of things that they will invest in because they can prevent. And of course, if she's already not well, there's going to be even more that they'll spend to try to bring the curve to a better place. Organizations like Orca are out there right now doing the digital health assessment side. They're going through thousands and thousands of apps trying to assess where are they in their advancement. Are they just direct to consumer, kind of over the counter quality solutions, or are they actual clinical solutions? Are they integrated? Are they integratable in? That whole interoperability issue in the US, there's now a big push towards interoperability and penalties if your data is not fluid. All of this stuff is moving at the speed of trust. Trust, as we know, is kind of not something that we have a lot of.
Abundance of,
yeah, not a lot of it, not a lot of trust. Everything tends to move at the speed of trust in healthcare right now because there's misaligned financial incentives. Data is monetizable. So not everybody wants to share it, and government's trying to make that go away. Some of their interoperability requirements they put into place. Real penalties are coming out now for health systems that aren't sharing data. So we'll see what happens in the coming years. I'm pragmatically optimistic. I think there'll just be a lot of 2 steps forward, 1 back on a pretty consistent ongoing basis. And now the marketplace is evolving too because of what's happening with the financial crisis, and organizations are just trying to figure out what do we actually have to do. And there's roll up of companies happening to kind of create more what I'll call platform plays, because the buyers of these solutions are getting what I'll call point solution fatigue, right? There's just too many small little toys that they're being asked to take a look at and assess. They'd rather look at how do I buy a platform that addresses a bigger chunk of my issues.
Yeah, I'm hearing that some of them are seeing 20 or more per day, right, in their inbox, and that's going to become overwhelming. I think, given timing, maybe we should move to as usual, we didn't get through all my questions because there were some interesting lines of thought to follow. But I want to maybe ask a slightly different question for each of you, or the same question in a different way. Naomi, you've been looking at the research and the applications of it in the neuro space and in the training space before that, right? If you were to talk to researchers who were interested to develop a new model or a new approach, and now having spent a fair bit of this year engaging with entrepreneurs, with investors, with industry, I'm going to ask both questions, right? I'm going to ask you and I'm going to ask Paulo, and then I'll let you each respond to the parts that you want to, or respond as you like. What would you recommend they start looking at in terms of the problem before they start building their solution, right? And then Paulo, investing in companies and working with and advising companies. If somebody's looking to start a company, or they've already started, a digital health company, an earlier stage company, and they're trying to, generate some traction, flesh out a business model, what are, some of the most important questions you would have them look at early on, like really dive into as they're trying to formulate their strategy? And I don't mean, these can be the standard business model questions, but I would frame it a little differently in terms of the things that you tend to see early stage companies have gone a fair ways down the road, and they've sort of forgotten to address something that's rather fundamental. How could they get a more efficient start and make sure they're going as much as possible, in the absence of all the data, in the right direction? So those are broad questions. And I don't know, Naomi, if you'd like to go first. And if I've asked something that's a little bit out of your wheelhouse, feel free to answer it from the perspective of what you're actually seeing and working on.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, actually. Where should researchers start? And I think there's a real gap. Often people who are in research, they work in really deep silos, and they don't tend to come out of the silo and look across the board at what could be useful in the real world. So they go through education, often they stay in education, and then they're doing their research, but they just become more and more and more specialized. And so I think there's a really good case for events such as yours, Christian, in Lisbon, which brought together people from their different silos, along with people who were working in industry, in healthcare, with patients, with service users, so that they can get a sense of where the problems are in society. And ideally, before they start working on that research, they would be attending those events. They would be engaging as part of what we're trying to do at the Applied Neuroscience Association as well, is to give researchers access to industry, to healthcare, so that they get a sense of where are the problems, what are people struggling with in the area that I'm roughly interested in, so that they can start thinking about potential translation of their research even before they start doing the research. That's not to say there's not a case for basic research. I think there's a really important case for doing basic research as well. But and amazing things have come out of that, like CRISPR came out of just basic research and a curiosity in something without necessarily knowing where that was going to go. But I think having that sense of where it's translatable is hugely important. And I think also its co-production approaches is really important. So making sure that whoever's going to be on the receiving end is actually involved in the development, in helping to solve the problem in the first place. Because otherwise you end up with things for, that are designed for somebody. If they don't want it, they're not interested in it, or it's patronizing, or it's just not engaging. So a lot of interventions are not designed to be accessible to the people who necessarily need them. Like, for example, people with ADHD need different approaches, and then you've got the other thing which Paulo, you reminded me about when you were talking earlier, is that we've got certain populations who for whom the research, they've just been left out of the research. Like women, for example, it was harder to study women in research because they have menstrual cycles. So, there's something going on that the researcher can't control. It might mess up their data. Let's just leave them out altogether. And then, of course, they're at greater risk of dying from all the medications that have been produced because they've been tested on men. So women are at twice the risk of anxiety, twice the risk of dementia to men. So, and that's not surprising because they've been left out of the research process. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and quite often, just to riff on that, quite often while you'll see what a label says for medicine, when you go back and just look at the real world evidence of what actually happened, because now you've opened it up to everybody, not just some selection criteria subset, you're going to get very different results, and that's to be expected. Luckily for pharma, they don't have to change the label by and large, unless it's something that's a black box warning typically. But they're not going to. This goes back to the issue we talked about earlier, Christian, right? Risk is just too high. Got to get some label. We spent a lot of money, then we'll figure out what happens after that. Going very broad. Imagine 10-year morbidity and mortality study across all genders, races, different parts of the planet. That study would cost $5 billion, and your patent life would be over by the time you get the results. So there's just a whole series of pressures that aren't aligned. And there's lots of people trying to figure out different ways to deal with that. Like, for instance, you wouldn't potentially start a patent's life until the FDA approved it, versus losing time in the study phase. There's all kinds of things you can do to be creative, but that just doesn't exist. To answer the other question you asked, what do I look at as it relates to startups, and what are the kind of things I focus in on? A whole lot of different things, but in particular, have they spent enough time really with the end user, right? Is there real product market fit? Do they understand the user's experience? And when I mean the user, I don't mean just the end user of the solution, so the patient, but also what does it look like when you try to scale the solution for the providers that are involved in Naomi's care, if she's the person who's the actual end user. Does Dr. Christian actually see that data? How does it affect his activities? How does he get paid for it or not? I mean, all of these ecosystem issues typically are not thought of as it relates to the product development process. They just test it in the person. They're not looking at like what happens when I have to bring this to scale. So really, really draconianly focused on UX experience across the ecosystem of stakeholders that exists. And that could be caregivers too, not just me, but you're using an app, I'm a parent, the kid's using an app, how do I see it? How do I monitor what's going on? So there's a whole series of like drawing out the ecosystem of stakeholders that are going to be touched by that solution coming into the market. Business model testing. We just talked a little bit about the product testing and seeing what that user experience is, but business model testing it. How does it get paid? Who pays for it? How does distribution occur? Who has to be the gatekeeper? Does there have to be a gatekeeper? Can you sell it directly? Is it B2B2C? Is it B2B to P2C? There's a whole series of different business models that need to be tested to see what's the kind of the path of least resistance, and how does your solution thread the needle, or not just a product perspective, but a business model perspective. Are the financials right for the drug, right? As to how do you price and contract this thing, understanding what's the true value proposition rather than just picking a number out of the air, or doing just what's my competition charge. That doesn't sit really well with somebody who's actually on the buy side of this thing, right? As an investor, I'm always trying to look at, have you thought about the buy side of this? who the buyers are, how does this fit in versus the rest of the solutions they're offering, how does it displace what I'll call the operational challenges of getting it in. So I've got this shiny new mental health app. How do I scale this thing, right? How does it fit into my system? What does it do from a staffing perspective to retrain? And I, as a company selling this product, do I have solutions and answers to all this stuff, including how do I get people to become aware of it, to become users of it, to stay on it, and to come back to it if they drop off. Most of the organizations you're going to be selling this to, whether it's a health system or insurer or some other stakeholder, don't have those skill sets, right? So if you're not building that as part of your solution, the product is the basic piece. But if you're not building this around the solution, that's going to be a much harder sell, because an insurance company or a health system is going to ask you, well, great, this is a great tool. How do you help me scale this? Like, what do you do to enable me to actually get it to my people, get the data back so I can see that it's improving my quality ratings or something? There's a whole series of complexity around above and beyond the product that has to be in place. And the other part is just, frankly, just really looking at their team, right? It's problem, product, progress, and then people, of course. That's not the right order, but that's all four important. And is the team you're bringing together to make this happen? Can they deal with all the issues that I just laid out? The product side, the business side, the scaling side. And have they done this? If they haven't, do they have the right skill sets to go tackle it?
Yeah,
and then maybe you write them a check.
Paulo, that was a great wrap up. I think it leaves us openers to dive in with many other discussions and panels down the road. So I want to thank you both. We're going to talk to the guys at Biotechgate, because this recording will be hosted in their platform during the partnering, but afterwards I want to make sure it gets out to our network more broadly and that we can share it. So we'll do that. And I think it gives us openers for a bunch of things. I hope to see you both before then, but if not, I definitely hope to see you in Lisbon next October, and in San Jose end of June for the Brain Capital and Education Technology. And as soon as we confirm the psychedelic therapeutics, it may not be your day-to-day focus, but I think it would be fun to have you both there. So when we have a date on that, I will let you both know. For the audience, thanks for joining. Take note of those comments at the end. It's great starting advice when you're developing a business plan. Naomi, as you were wrapping up, I thought of several other follow-up questions I wanted to ask, but we're not going to do it today. But you prompted a few other conversations we could have, so let's tackle those down the road. So thanks to both of you. Thanks to Biotechgate. Thanks to our partners, and have a great day, and hope to see you both soon.
Yep. Thanks for having us, Christian. Take care.
Thank you so much.